So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about the practices we have for being at peace in a world that's not. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but it seems like there's a little chaos and confusion happening in the world. The talk is going to be based on a sutra on transforming violence and fear. So to begin with, we're going to enjoy 3 sounds of the bell and come back to ourselves and breathe. And then I'm going to read a poem. I think that it's always good, especially I've been feeling like that now that this new year has begun, this new decade, that it really is helpful to envision the world I want to have happen and to set an intention to do everything I can to help create it. So we'll enjoy 3 sounds of the bell and begin. So I wanted to begin with a poem by Pablo Neruda, a Chilean poet. He says, "Now we will count to 12, and we will all keep still. For once on the face of the earth, let's not speak in any language. Let's stop for 1 second and not move our arms so much. It would be an exotic moment, without rush, without engines. We would all be together in a sudden strangeness. Fishermen in the cold sea would not harm whales, and the man gathering salt would look at his hurt hands. Those who prepare green wars, wars with gas, wars with fire, victory with no survivors, would put on clean clothes and walk about with their brothers in the shade, doing nothing. What I want should not be confused with total inactivity. Life is what it is about. I want no truck with death. If we were not so single-minded about keeping our lives moving, and for once could do nothing, perhaps a huge silence might interrupt this sadness of never understanding ourselves and of threatening ourselves with death. Perhaps the earth can teach us, as when everything seems dead and later proves to be alive. Now I'll count to 12. You keep quiet and I will go." So I just love the images he creates and the urging of us to stop. This is always the beginning of our practice. How can we just stop and come back to ourselves and be peace? That's when we can get some clarity. So today I wanted to offer some thoughts about a sutra the Buddha offered 2,600 years ago. And it was the Sutra on Transforming Violence and Fear. First, I'll read the first 6 gathas from the sutra. "Let us listen and observe to understand how, from a peaceful and secure situation, we have brought society into a state of terrorism and violence. How have successive generations behaved for the situation to become like this? I want to talk to you about this suffering and tell you how I have been able to let go of fear. People in the world experience one suffering after another, like a fish living in a pond that is drying up day by day. In this situation, violent thoughts arise, and out of ignorance, people seek to relieve their suffering by terrorizing and punishing others. The whole world is on fire with violence in the 10 directions. All is in chaos. Every part of the world is troubled. Nowhere is really safe and secure. Everyone sees himself as superior to others. Few people know how to let go of attachment. Unable to see this, people continue to nurture their wrong perceptions. We tie ourselves up in our wrong perceptions, which just bring more darkness and pain into our lives. I have looked deeply into the minds of unhappy people, and I have seen hidden under their suffering a sharp-pointed knife. Because they cannot see that sharp-pointed knife in their mind, it's difficult for them to bear the pain. The pain brought about by the sharp-pointed knife lasts a long time and does not change because they hold on to that knife wherever they go. Their pain spills out into the world. Only when they have a chance to recognize the knife, take it out of their hearts, will their suffering cease, and only then will they stop causing suffering. Do not allow yourself to be caught in any of the entanglements of the world. The roots of disturbance in our mind have to be cut off. Let go of what disturbs you. Stop leaning on it. If you can let go of wrong desires, you can overcome all misfortune. Only when the practitioner can break free from the cycle of suffering can she succeed in realizing liberation. Okay? So this is 2,600 years ago, and the Buddha is writing about the violence and terrorism. The whole world is on fire in the 10 directions. And as a little background to the sutra, I think it's really important to help us understand. I was fortunate enough to sit a retreat with Sister True Virtue, Sister Annabelle, last summer, and she gave her commentary on this. And it turns out that the Buddha was from the Shakya clan. His family was the Shakya clan. And they had a neighboring king, Prasenajit. And King Prasenajit had a concubine who was not of a Brahmin birth. She was of very low birth. And she had a child named Varudika. The two of them together had the child named Varudika. And when Varudika was like 8 or 9, the King Prasenajit took his family to visit the Shakya clan to learn archery. That's what they were noted for, the Buddha's family. So they showed up, and the Shakya clan had built this beautiful meditation hall specifically for the Buddha. And when Varudika and his little friends showed up, they went right into the meditation hall and started playing around like on the Buddha throne and things like that. One of the members of the Shakya clan, who it seems wasn't very skillful, got very upset. The Shakya clan got upset, but the one member came to Varudika and said, "It's very clear you're of low birth. That's why you're so disrespectful." And they were very, very upset with these kids for goofing around in the meditation hall. So Varudika took this to heart and was humiliated. He was so embarrassed and ashamed. And Prasenajit and his family went home, but Varudika held on to that pain and resentment his whole life. This is what the Buddha is talking about when he says, here we go. I have looked deeply into the minds of unhappy people. I have seen hidden under their suffering a sharp-pointed knife. Because they cannot see that sharp-pointed knife in their mind, it's difficult for them to bear the pain. And so what he's talking about there is that Varudika, this child, grew up. His whole life, he had this sharp-pointed knife. The sharp-pointed knife gets embedded in our hearts when our pride is injured. And that sharp-pointed knife got embedded in his heart. And he held on to that resentment and just fed it. When we do that, that's a manas consciousness, our ego, that keeps stabbing us over and over again. We just repeatedly reinforce and water those unwholesome seeds in our consciousness. And so this is what Varudika did. And he later became king himself, and he waged war on the Shakya family and almost decimated the entire clan. So when the Buddha says, I've looked deeply into the hearts of unhappy people, he's had some experience in this area. 3 times he tried to stop Varudika from going to war with his family, and it didn't work. So This was from his personal experience. But I love the question that the Buddha begins this with. He says, how have successive generations behaved for the situation to become like this? How did we come from a peaceful and secure situation into this state of terrorism and violence? I think those are really good questions for us to ask ourselves in the times we're living in. Because a lot of times we just look at the surface of things and just at what's manifesting right in this moment, when in fact the causes and conditions for this to manifest have been going on for decades, sometimes longer than that. So I love the questions. And how have successive generations behaved for the situation to become like this? That's a really good question to ask ourselves. The Buddha had offered us the teachings on the poisons, hatred and greed and delusion. And if we look at the situation we're in and we see what previous generations have done, to me it looks like those seeds have been well watered. Hatred, greed, and delusion are at the root of a whole lot of the difficulties we're experiencing right now. So he said, when people they experience one suffering after another, like fish living in a pond that's drying up, the fear that arises. Imagine when you're a fish in a pond and you have no water, your survival is threatened and you become fearful. When people become fearful, violent thoughts arise, and out of ignorance they seek to relieve their suffering by terrorizing and punishing others. And this is what Verutica did. Generally what we try to do is, if we're feeling that pain, we have that knife in our heart and we don't know it's there. This is where the difficulty happens. He says, we don't recognize, they cannot see the sharp-pointed knife in their mind. It's difficult for them to bear the pain. All we feel is the pain. We don't realize the knife is there causing it. And so just out of reaction to the pain that we're experiencing, we react from the pain. And generally when we're in a lot of pain, what tends to happen is people want to inflict pain on other people. They want people to understand how horrible they feel. They want you to feel their pain. And so they can inflict pain on other people. This is what Verutica did. So he said, only when they have a chance to recognize the knife, take it out of their hearts, will their suffering cease, and only then will they stop causing suffering. So this is our big challenge, is to recognize the knives that we have in our hearts. And we all have them, not to the same extent perhaps that Verutica did. But what happens is when we instill fear like that in people, it spreads and it escalates. I'm reminded of somebody putting an explosive in their shoe to get on an airplane. They get discovered, and then for decades afterwards, everybody's taking their shoes off at the airport. This is what happens, right? And for every single one of us that has those knives in our hearts that we don't recognize, and we take drastic action from reacting to that pain, what then happens is that the mistrust spreads, that then nobody can trust anybody, that everybody's living in more fear, more unease. We don't realize what we're doing to create hell realms for ourselves. So then people who suffer, like I said, want other people to suffer. They want to punish other people. And the trouble is, like I said, they want to inflict pain so other people could feel as bad as they do. And the mistaken thinking is that that's going to make them feel better. We think that that's going to relieve our suffering, when in fact it has nothing to do. It doesn't. It doesn't work. But we do it anyway. So this whole escalation happens because we don't know how to handle our own suffering. And this is one of the basic teachings of the Buddha, that he taught the first noble truth is that suffering exists. And almost all of his teachings, when somebody asked him about death and dying, they said, what happens after we die? What happens if there is no separate self? Who is it that reincarnates? And he said, I won't entertain the question because I would be entertaining the possibility of a separate self, and I would be dealing with speculation. I don't deal with speculation. I deal only with suffering and the end of suffering. So he was very clear in his lifetime, and many people in his lifetime called him the great physician for that reason, that he just wanted to alleviate suffering. So we all have our own confusions. We can't see the truth. We rely on our own misperceptions. What was the misperception here? There, Thich Nhat Hanh says, at the root of every difficulty is a misperception. What was the misperception? Varudika, what was his misperception? His misperception was that there was something wrong with him, that he wasn't good enough. What does it say in the Sutra? It says everybody thinks they're superior to everybody else, right? So what happened in this case? The person says, you're of a low birth. You're not as good as I am. I'm better than you are. And when we separate ourselves out like that, we're automatically creating hell realms. And what we also do is suffer. His misperception was that it was about him. He could not see that this person was being unskillful. The person who said that was supremely unskillful. And so if he had been a little older, quite a bit older, and a lot wiser, he would have been able to see through that and say, wow, that's a really pretty nasty thing to say, and it has more to do with the person saying it than it has to do with me. This is the advantage of our practice, that when we develop our concentration and our mindfulness, then when something like that happens, instead of just reacting, we can breathe to our belly 3 times. We can look deeply at what really is going on here. We can look at our own reactions and notice that, wow, some of those seeds have been well watered in me already, that I'm not feeling good enough. And so I need to take care of that in myself. But that would require some age and wisdom that Varudika did not have. So, but the thing that happens is that when we can't see the truth, we rely on our misperceptions. We truly believe that our perception's dead on. We all believe that we're seeing our vision is 20/20. And what came to mind when I was reading this was during the presidential campaign, the last one, when it became clear that there was a rumor going around. And the rumor was that Hillary Clinton had a child trafficking thing going on in the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. That was, everybody were laughing, but the fact is, people believe that. People believe the misperception, and then they act on it. So some guy showed up in the pizza parlor in Washington with a shotgun. He could have really done serious damage, all based on a misperception. I was very happy to see, we just had the new year, and Chief Justice John Roberts from the Supreme Court wrote a 4-page end of the year. He writes it every year, I guess. It's a yearly thing that he does, an update on the courts. And one of the things that he cited in there was the danger of these kinds of misperceptions and fake news. And he said that John Jay, who was one of the people working on the Federalist Papers, tried to break up a mob at one point. There was a mob who, a rumor floating around that doctors were digging up graves to use the corpses to study. And it wasn't true. But this angry mob believed that it was, and John Jay went to calm the mob down. They threw a rock at him, hit him in the head. And he then wasn't able to continue his work on the Federalist Papers. So it was left up to Hamilton, I think it was, in Madison, to finish up the project. But all based on a rumor, all based on a misperception. So why am I sharing this at this time, you might ask? Uh, I think that it's so relevant. When I first heard this sutra, I thought, I can't believe this was written when it was. It's just so helpful. And ever since I've been working with it, it's been so helpful to me that rather than criticize and judge someone, I try my best to see that sharp-pointed knife, to automatically go and say, aha, they have a knife in their heart. And that really helps me to not get caught in going to war with the person. The other really important piece in this part of the sutra, I thought, was the importance of acceptance. The importance of accepting someone as they are. That I don't think there's anything more unkind than wanting somebody to be somebody else. That I know how many children are born into situations where they're not accepted in their families, that people want them to be different than they are. Why can't you be more like, fill in the blank? And I think it does serious damage to our consciousness. So, and again, what it does is it plays on manas consciousness, the ego. The same thing that happened to Varudika. It says you're not good enough. And I'm good, you're bad, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm better than you. That kind of separating out again. And the thing about this is we don't understand, usually we're too young to understand that we've created this disturbance in our own mind, that we take the ball and run with it, and then we just keep acting that out. We keep playing from that same place. Thich Nhat Hanh has always told us that when we practice equanimity, upeksha, when we practice equanimity, that means that we accept it all, that we try to accept somebody just as they are. When he teaches the paramita of patience, he talks about it as being inclusiveness and says that we need to accept somebody exactly as they are without any idea that they're ever going to be any different, that they're not ever going to change. When we can do that, he says, we create enough spaciousness so they can change if they want to. And I found this to be true of how I treat myself and how I treat other people. That when I can give myself that spaciousness and just accept it right now, I'm as good as I get. And don't waste time or energy trying to think, oh, you should have, could have, would have, if only, you should be different. Then it frees up all this energy for me to actually try my best to manifest the highest and best in the present moment. So this is what the Buddha, and this is what Thich Nhat Hanh has asked us to do with everybody that we meet. What happens then is that we're able to see other people's suffering as our own. When I can understand my own suffering, when I can discover that I have a sharp-pointed knife in my heart, when suddenly it becomes clear to me that, oh my gosh, that's been in there forever, and I didn't even know it. One of my first retreats, I had this experience. Some of you are familiar with this story, I think, but one of my first retreats, it was a silent retreat, and Richard tried to keep me from talking, so he called home, retrieved our messages, and had a thing saying that a note, gave me a note saying, somebody called wanting this thing of yours. I called her and said, sure. And I was enraged. I was so furious, I couldn't believe it. And it was a mystery to me. I was stunned because if I had gotten the message, I would have called her and said, sure. So I thought there's something really fishy going on. And I needed to look at that. So I sat down and meditated on that. I wanted to just feel the rage that I was. I mean, I was mad. I was really, really mad. And so I just tried to get in touch with how angry I was. What's this about? When did I feel like this before? And I was transported right back to being 11. And I had a surrogate father. My father had a lot of anger. in him. And we lived in a duplex. We lived downstairs, another couple lived upstairs. They didn't have children. And when I was a month old, my mom left me on the porch and in my little stroller, and he came home from work, reached down, I grabbed his finger, that was it, we were in love. So he gave me nothing but unconditional love for the first 11 years of my life. He was a total gift in my life. And when I was 11, he died of a heart attack. So here I am at a retreat, 40 years old, and I get this totally weird reaction to Richard doing something like that. And where do I get transported to? I just follow the feeling, and I go right back to this conversation with my parents telling me that he had died. And I thought, this is fascinating, because they said he had died 2 days earlier. He had had the heart attack 2 days earlier, then he died 2 days later. And nobody told me, because they didn't want an 11-year-old to see somebody with all the tubes and things. They thought that would be too upsetting. So there they were, just doing their best to be good parents. They were doing it out of kindness, really. But nobody asked me. That was the sticking place. And so I was not considered at all. This was the most important thing in my life, and nobody asked me. And what I had no idea, and so here, the sharp-pointed knife was in my heart, very well embedded. And what I didn't realize, I had no idea it was there, because my parents had no idea how to deal with death and dying at that point. And at that point, they didn't have any kind of child psychologist or something to help kids through those things. So it was just, that was it. He was dead. And I knew on the spot, as I sat there really revisiting the conversation, I knew that feeling of powerlessness. There was nothing I was going to do. He's dead. There's nothing to do about it. It's done. And that feeling of total frozen grief and powerlessness was really huge in me. So immediately, I felt nothing but compassion for my parents. I felt nothing but compassion for me at 11. And I felt nothing but compassion for Richard. I thought, poor Richard, there he is trying his best to keep me from having to talk at a retreat. And here I am giving him the evil eye. How dare you do that? So it turns out that what I realized sitting on my bench was that I had overreacted to not being considered for 30 years of my life it would have been by then. So I would have this wild overreaction, just like I did at the retreat. I'm enraged over something like that. So this can be so helpful to us in our practice, because once we recognize that's that sharp-pointed knife, once we recognize that it's there, once we see what the outcome has been, what's the habit, energy, and conditioning that's happened because of that, then we can correct for that. So it wasn't like after that insight that I had, everybody in the world became very considerate. It was that when people were not considerate, I could feel that come up in me and say, aha, lack of consideration, my little friend, you're back again. I can recognize you for what you are. And I don't have to react. I can just breathe to my belly and know what this is about. It has nothing to do with the situation that I'm in. Okay? So this is why Tai and the Buddha always say we have to get to the root cause of the suffering in order for us to transform and heal. Our practice shows us all the ways, as I've just described, to recognize. As long as we develop our mindfulness and our concentration, we're much more capable of recognizing when we're having that kind of energy come up in us, whatever the energy is, whether it's sadness, whether it's anger, whatever it is, fear, and not react from that place, just out of habit. The other teaching of this sutra that I wanted to just briefly touch on is it also demonstrates the power of words, that how deadly our words can be, that some thoughtless comment made to a 8-year-old later destroyed how many lives, countless lives were destroyed because of it. And this is what I've said all along. It was very interesting for me to read it because Whenever we study the 5 precepts, and the first is not killing, I oftentimes will say, people focus on being vegetarian or whatever, and I say I really look at the 4th on mindful speech as being capable of doing a lot more killing than the first. I think a lot of our spirits get killed by what gets said to us. So we need to be careful with our words. We need to be careful with our thoughts and with our deeds, just like the triple karma, the ways that we create karma. The other thing that I think is so important is for us to constantly be looking at it from the place of interbeing. Because when we can see that this person is not my enemy, we can label somebody as the other, we can label somebody as the enemy. We need to have no enemies. Jesus Christ said, love your enemy. And Thich Nhat Hanh jokes and says, Jesus was incorrect, because when you love your enemy, they're no longer your enemy anymore. So we need to be able to understand that people's actions are not them. That we need, because if we get caught in mistaking the actions for the person and wind up developing this kind of, we stick a knife in our own heart, and we wind up harming our own consciousness by holding on to hatred and anger toward this person, creating an other. So when we can not do that, we can perhaps sit down with somebody who we had difficulty with and say, I've realized I've had this knife in my heart, and this is what I've learned from this knife. I don't want to have it in there anymore. I really want to extract that knife. And I don't know if you're interested in this or not, but if you are, I would really like to help extract yours as well. Okay? So we can do that for each other, and especially if we're both practitioners, it's much easier. We can understand that a little bit better. But anyway, I would just like to end this section. We need to recognize that our thoughts, words, and deeds have the power to sow seeds. They will sow the seeds of violence, anger, and hatred. They can. And that can have horrible repercussions. When we talk about the importance of acceptance, of being able to let somebody know that they're okay, that we accept them just the way they are. We recently saw the film on Mr. Rogers. I don't know if any of you have seen that film. And I thought it was such a beautiful depiction that for those of you who haven't seen the film, there's a journalist who he's been getting a little, what did I say, kind of hostile in his approach to journalism and outing people and that kind of thing. And so his editor gives him the assignment of doing a profile of Mr. Rogers. And he's really kind of miffed by the whole thing, that he thinks that's kind of baby talk. But it turns out that the whole thing is transformative for him. And it was so beautiful to watch Mr. Rogers. Tom Hanks is depicting Mr. Rogers, but I think he did it well, because I remember Mr. Rogers being able to simply be present. That there was no criticism, there was no judgment, there was no suggestion for improvement, there was nothing. All it was acceptance. I'm accepting you just as you are. What did Mr. Rogers always say? I like you just the way you are, right? And that's exactly what the Buddha taught. So Mr. Rogers, I'm going to end with a couple quotes from Mr. Rogers. He said, love isn't a state of perfect caring. It's an active noun like struggle. To love someone is to strive to accept that person exactly the way he or she is right here, right now. And I love the fact that he talks about it's not passive, that love is active, that love is a practice. It's a very deep practice. To be able to see the Buddha nature in everyone. And some people it's so deeply disguised. It's covered up with layers and layers and layers of habit energy and conditioning, and sometimes obnoxiousness. all of that. So it's a really deep practice to try to cut through the surface and really see the Buddha nature shining through. And I think that's what Mr. Rogers was able to do. Let's see, I think, yeah, I do. There we go. He also said, knowing that we can be loved exactly as we are gives us all the best opportunity for growing into the healthiest of people. See? So knowing we can be loved, this starts at home. This is an inside job. Can we love ourselves exactly as we are? We don't have to wait to be acted upon by something outside of ourselves. We don't need to go any place outside of ourselves for positive reinforcement. We need to do this for ourselves. We need to be able to remember that we came into this world happy, healthy, fearless, and at peace with nothing but our Buddha nature. And that we've had a lifetime of incrustation with habits and conditioning and hurts, woundedness, sharp knives, all of that. But underneath it all, that's who we are. That's our true nature. And we have to keep a direct line of communication open with that part of ourselves. When we can do that for ourselves, it's so much easier to see this in everybody. Then you can have, I can't tell you how many people I've dealt with that are real curmudgeonly. And I see them and I almost want to laugh because I think you're a marshmallow. Underneath that crusty exterior, I know that there's a marshmallow. You're that Buddha. You can't fool me. And it drives people crazy, really, when they're trying to convince you that they're real curmudgeons. But anyway, I hope that I've offered you something that you can put to good use. I have to say, that was only the first 6 verses of the Sutra, and there are 20. So, but I felt that was more than enough for us to try to, it's been enough for me to practice with for quite some time now. And I have found it to be really, really helpful. I hope that I've offered you something that can be helpful to you. And thank you again for being here. We will listen to 3 more sounds of the bell. So, dear friends, some of you have written me some questions. One is, would you please talk about how to protect oneself from mistreatment while accepting someone else for who they are and loving them? I'd be happy to. That the Buddha said you could search the whole world over, you'll never find anybody more deserving of your compassion than you. And when we practice from that place, we are committed to being our own best parent, to having our own back, to taking really good care of ourselves, and wouldn't put up with abuse for a second. That if somebody's being abusive to us, we're not there. That we don't have to hate them. That's the ticket. That it's say, I'm sorry, but we're really not being all right with each other right now. This is being hurtful, and this is going to cause more and more suffering, and I need to leave. Maybe when we both can breathe and calm down, we can continue our conversation. But until that happens, I'm not willing to continue. We need to be very, very clear and be really kind to ourselves. It requires having a lot of compassion for oneself to say, oh, no, no. I always like to think of it as if I were a child, if I were taking care of a child, would I allow somebody to talk to a child that way? If I wouldn't allow anybody to talk to a child the way this person is talking to me, it's over. So, of course, Richard and I recently had some work done on our house, and we had to ream through some old boxes of papers and things and found this old testing. A friend of ours was going to social work school, and she wanted to use us as guinea pigs, taking Myers-Briggs tests and things like that, and personalities and preferences. And I had to laugh because on the one of the qualities that they tested for was assertiveness, and I scored 95%. So when I say don't put up with anything, you can put that in the mix. I just think it's critically important that we don't abandon ourselves. That's usually where the source of a whole lot of sadness and pain comes from in us, is if we have put up with things we shouldn't put up with and have abandoned ourselves. So we need to make commitments to ourselves. This is when we do the healing of the past. We have to make a very strong commitment to take really good care of ourselves and have our own back. Why is it so painful to remove the knife? This acceptance and a general recognition that the other will return the knife. How do I respect this primary relationship without continuing to have it harm me? It's painful to remove the knife. A lot of times it's painful because it's habit. And a lot of times it's painful because then we really have to recognize we were hurt. That anger and hatred are more comfortable a lot of times. There's much more action in anger. It's much more of an active feeling than grief or sadness or whatever. So a lot of times it's very hard for us to touch those places of vulnerability and hurt. So that can keep that knife stuck in there as well. And I think that worrying about whether or not the other will return the knife, we can do beginning anew with a person and not have any knives to return. There's nothing to be afraid of. When you're very solid and clear with yourself, you don't have to be afraid of other people. You don't have to be afraid of them treating you badly because you're not going to be treated badly. It's like you decide. But that comes from being a child. That a lot of times we're stuck in that childhood fear that most of these things take root when we're powerless. We don't have any agency at all. And we just had to take it. We had to put up with it. And we remember viscerally, at a very visceral level, we remember how, and we've made a choice. I'm never going to feel like that again. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid that. And so that's part of, I think, what the pain is about. So it's a multidimensional practice. How do we come to terms with the fact that there are people with enormous power who clearly are full of sharp-pointed knives? I think that coming to terms with is not that hard. I mean, it's obvious they are. There are a lot of people with lots of sharp-pointed knives, and there are a lot of people in power. What our job is to do everything we can to do what we can to alleviate the suffering, to prevent them from causing suffering for other people, if we can, to not allow them to poison our stream of consciousness by allowing ourselves to fall into hatred and anger toward them. That then we just become them. Okay? And so it's not a matter of having it be them and us. It's a matter of saying this person is horribly wounded. And I can see their suffering. It doesn't mean you condone the behavior. Don't mistake those two. That's really critically important. Most people that cause enormous suffering are horribly wounded, and they need to be stopped. But we don't have to hate them. the Neruda poem, what was the title? I think it's called Now We Will Count to 12. That was what it was on the thing that I had copied. How to speak to people who are caught in a us and them mentality. To me, the most important thing is to listen. That really try to understand them, to really try to say, what is it that caught you there? I think I shared with a lot of you about coming into connection with somebody who had very different political views than I did. And she was from Arizona. And the part that I have a hard time with, as I've stated publicly before, is with babies being taken away from parents. I just don't know how anybody can think that that's okay. I just can't. I have no place in my consciousness for that. And I said that, and this person got very upset and took off, and then came back and started carrying on small talk with me. But you could tell she was curious. And so knowing where she was coming from, all I did was send her metta and breathe. And I thought, there's not any convincing, there's no arguing, I'm not going to overwhelm this person with facts. I just want to find common ground. That's my goal here, is just find common ground. And so she kept getting closer and closer and closer, and finally was sitting next to me. And then she couldn't help but get into politics again. And she said, well, you have to understand, I'm from Arizona, and immigrants have taken all the jobs, and we have a huge unemployment rate. And I said, well, you're preaching to the converted. I said, nobody could understand you better than I do. I'm from Appalachia originally. My family's still there. And I have had a front row seat to observe the violence of poverty. And I've seen unemployment and the havoc that it wreaks in people's lives and their families, the anger and the embarrassment and the humiliation of not being able to provide for your family and your children. I said, so, I'm on exactly the page you are. Nobody would be a bigger advocate for full employment than I would. I said, but the only thing I don't understand is why do we have to create such division, discord, and hatred in order to create jobs? And then there was dead silence. And I thought, well, it's not bad. And the next morning, we were staying at a hotel at this time. This is somebody that I just met in passing. And the next morning, we're all checking out. And this woman came up with her daughter. She goes, I want you to meet my friend Joanne. We had the greatest conversation yesterday morning. And she went on and on and on. And she gave me a hug and a kiss goodbye before they left. So to me, it's not a matter of trying to, I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're bad, I'm going to convince you, I'll wear you down and convince you with the facts, I'll just overwhelm you. But can I let her know that I understood? That I heard her, what she was saying, and I did understand what she's talking about. And to be understood, and then to say yes, and. It's like I wasn't disagreeing, it was yes, and. Also, why do we have to hate each other to do that? I hope that answers that question. How do we hold full acceptance in our role of providing guidance and limit setting as parents, particularly with older children? I think that, again, it's a matter of when you say full acceptance, it doesn't mean accepting behavior. It's acceptance of who the person is. It's loving the person, but it's not condoning bad behavior, ever. That, and I think you can be really clear. I think you can be really clear. I think it's one of the hardest jobs in the world. That also, because I think a lot of things play into being a parent when it comes to doing those kinds of things, like fear. That, oh my gosh, they're going to do something, they're going to die, they're going to hurt themselves, their brain's not completely finished yet, and they're making these choices, and it's terrifying. And so it's one of the hardest things, and I'm in awe of parents, actually. And however, what I always had suggested to parents when I was in that line of work was that what often would happen out of fear, parents would become angry, that they would just show it through anger, but it was really a cover for how scared they were. And so I would talk to the parent about, do your best, even though I know that he's really screwed up right now and he's really made some serious mistakes. Do your best to try to pay attention all day long to what he does right and to give him feedback every time he does anything right. Try your best to water the highest and best seeds in that person. That's how we get healthy, happy people. So anyway, I hope that that's clarified some things for some of you. And thank you again for being with us today.